I'm Karen Ho, the Assistant Director of IN-cube, and I will be your moderator for today's session. So obviously we all have experiences with fake news, and some of us might even have fallen victim to it one time or another. So today's topic on fake news and fact checking cannot be more timely in this day and age. So here to help us kickstart the event is none other than our Assistant Prof Nuri Kim from our Wikimbi School of Comms and Information, who will be sharing with us why and how fact-checking can actually stem the spread of fake news through third-party perception. Right, so Prof. Nuri, please.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Let me just share my screen here. Right, so good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be sharing my research with you today. I want to thank all of you for being here, and thank IN-cube for giving me this opportunity. So this talk is based on a paper that I wrote together with Dr. Myojung Chung of Northeastern University, who used to be our very good colleague at the Wikimbi School. And the title of the paper is When I Learned the News is False. And I'll be talking about how fact-checking can stem the spread of fake news on social media. So it is by now well established that social media, sadly, is a breeding ground for the diffusion of fake news. And just a quick search would pop up all sorts of stories, posts, news that are contentious in its veracity, like this particularly viral post that was viral on TikTok that claims that COVID-19 can make your arm magnetic. So that would be very cool, but unfortunately that's not the case. And this is amazingly, it's true even in places like Singapore, where there are stringent regulations like the POFMA, Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act. And this recent piece of fake news was particularly interesting for me, so I wanted to share it with you. So this news, the original story was posted by an Instagram user alleging that the four police officers, were taunting and reprimanding an elderly woman to put on her face mask. And online media like the Online Citizen and Singapore Uncensored, they picked it up and they posted the story as news. And beyond that, it went viral. So on various platforms, in various forms, the story really spread. Of course, since then, they've all been POFMA'd. So now all of these platforms are required to carry the correction notice. But what I thought was very interesting to note is that even in places like Singapore, where there are these kinds of stringent regulations, we're not immune to fake news. It's not enough. Rules and laws are not enough to stop fake news from budding and spreading. And there's another interesting kind of aspect to the story that I thought was worth sharing. And that's the contrast between the first piece of fake news that I showed you and the second piece of fake news. And so, at least to me as a perceiver, the first story about the COVID magnetic arm, based on my common sense and based on my knowledge of science, that's just blatantly untrue. And it's easy for me to rule that out as fake news. Whereas this second story, I'm showing you the Instagram version of it because I couldn't find the kind of properly news formatted version of the story. There are kind of issues that raises flags like the dramatically emotional nature of the writing or the font and various things. But taking those things aside, I think the nature of the story itself is quite plausible. So police have been known, not just in Singapore, but have been known in various places to approach citizens in a rather abrupt or perhaps more aggressive sorts of ways. And police noting that an elderly woman to put her mask on is not really out of the line. And so there are elements to the story that makes the whole piece a bit ambiguous. It's unclear. It's not very easy for us to rule this immediately as fake news. So I want you to kind of keep that thought because I'll be returning to that idea as I speak. So one way to combat the spread of fake news is through fact-checking. And for sure, fact-checking is not perfect. So there's been a lot of studies that indicated that fact-checking is not really effective in all cases, and it might depend on how the fact-checking is presented. So in cases where fact-checking is presented as a, kind of a truth thermometer sort of a thing, it may be less effective, or fact-checking is not effective if you have strong beliefs. So there are a lot of contingencies surrounding the effectiveness of fact-checking, and as Edson would share later on, and as other studies have noted, they may also have backfiring effects. So fact-checking, while trying to correct the misbelief, also plays a role in highlighting the piece of misinformation, and therefore it kind of makes it more salient at least one more time. And so there are some issues and some controversies surrounding fact-checking, which even led some social media platforms to reconsider the extensiveness of their efforts in fact-checking. Now, in this study, what we wanted to do was to introduce a fresh perspective when it came to research about fact-checking. And we do so by focusing on two kinds of things that we think were missed in past work. So the first idea is that we need to focus on behavior and less on beliefs. And this was because based on our observation that a lot of papers, a lot of research is really focused on whether or not fact-checking has this corrective function in revising your misbeliefs and, revising the misinformation that's spreading. But what we cared about and what we thought was perhaps more interesting or important is the fact that while your misbeliefs may not be completely revised, perhaps due to confirmation bias or your tendency to hold on to things that you already believe in, they may not be revised, at least not in the moment, not in the short run, but at least it may introduce a small crack in the system, so to speak, in that it kind of stops you from making that next step of clicking on share. So that's a behavioral ramification of fact-checking that we believe has been less researched in past work on fact-checking and fake news. And the reason that we thought that behavioral element is important is because those behaviors on aggregate contribute to the information environment that we will live in. So it's not just about an individual person believing in something or not believing in something. That's important too. But if we can stop the sharing, the spreading, if fact-checking can serve that function, that would have implications for the overall cleanliness, if you will, of the information environment. So we wanted to look at that part. We also wanted to look at the psychological mechanisms, identifying especially the how fact-checking works. So again, in past work, the focus has very much been on whether fact-checking works, whether it clarifies beliefs, and when it does, when is that? The when part has been researched more. But there has been very little efforts to uncover why exactly, what about fact-checking? What does it do to our understanding of the world? So we wanted to look at those psychological mechanisms. In order to do so, we draw from the third-person effects theory. And here I'm introducing one component of the theory, which is called the third-person perception. So this is referred to as the perceptual component of the third-person effect theory, which is the overall theory. And basically, this third-person perception component is pointing to a tendency for us to presume a greater media influence on you, on others, on the average Singaporean, as compared to myself. And here we're just talking about negative media content. So earlier studies, some of the studies Peng Hua has contributed to, some of the very early works on third-person effects, they looked at things like internet pornography or misogynistic rap lyrics. I keep saying lap lyrics, but rap lyrics. And in the context of Singapore, showing men with long hair on television, because at that time that was seen as a negative content. So all in all, they've been looking at negative media content and the tendency for people to presume you're going to be, affected by this, you're going to be harmed by this, but I'm kind of safe, I'm immune to this. And what we were focusing on was the fact that once fake news is flagged as fake news, it immediately can become perceived, it immediately becomes negative media content. So negative media content, it can also trigger this third-person perception, meaning this disparity between what how much you are influenced and how much I am influenced, the gap between presumed influence on others versus myself. So fake news can trigger that as long as it is understood or labeled as fake news. So that's where we are coming in. Remember, I was talking about the ambiguous types of news stories. Now, those ambiguous types of news stories may not necessarily be perceived as fake news, but once they are triggered, once they are flagged as fake news, they can have this kind of ensuing effect on your third-person perception, which could then lead to behavioral effects, which is the other part of the theory. Another part that we wanted to look at was the social media metrics. So social media metrics is very important in social media because it's a heuristic cue about the popularity and virality of a post. And when it comes to sharing fake news on social media platforms, social media metrics is definitely something to consider because news is not being shared in vacuum. News comes with this baggage of all these likes and shares and comments that put for the particular meaning to the piece of news or misinformation that you may or may not share. And past work has found that social media metrics typically leads to a bandwagoning effect, meaning that when people see, and I've had this experience too, I'm sure you've had this experience. So when you see a post with high number of likes or high number of shares, you kind of implicitly assume that it's not just popular, but probably, worth sharing in some way. And so something that has been shared a lot, you also tend to share as well. The problem is that fake news is often accompanied by high social media matrices. So this is because the uniqueness factor, the novelty, something is kind of, there are aspects that make these pieces of misinformation a bit viral. And so they often come with these high social media matrices. Now, what we wanted to focus on was, what does fact-checking do to alter the meaning of social media matrices that accompany fake news? So does it help to reduce that bandwagoning effect that we typically see with any kind of news with high social media metrics? So just to kind of summarize our arguments, our first hypothesis was basically just a very baseline effect. We wanted to see that by placing fact-checking, would that lower the perceived quality of fake news? And remember that here we're talking about the kinds of misinformation that are a bit ambiguous. So by placing the little debunking information towards the end of these posts, are they going to lower the perceived quality of fake news? The second part was our core question, where when fact-checking flags certain posts as this can potentially be false, then does that induce the disparity in the influence on others versus yourself? So the high third-person perception, does that kick in? Higher third-person perception, would that also lead to certain effects? So that's the effects part, or the behavioral component of the third-person effects theory. So there's the perceptual component, which is H2, and the behavioral component, which is what happens when you have this disparity? What happens when people presume a greater influence on others compared to themselves? And our contention based on third-person effects literature is that that's going to have behavioral implications. And in this case, in this setting, we're going to outline the behavior of sharing behavior. So it's going to demotivate people from sharing fake news. And finally, we wanted to look at whether social media matrices, the effect of high SMM is actually nipped at the bud when we introduce fact checking. So 2 studies were conducted to test these hypotheses. The first study was a simple, kind of a small scale MTurk study. And it was a very simple experimental design where we had a fake news only condition. As you can see here, this was a story about the Fukushima disaster and the impact on marine life on the fish in the west coast of the US. And same fake news story, but this time with the debunking information towards the end. So there are 2 fact checkers telling the readers that this has been fact-checked and it's not accurate. The second study was a Qualtrics panel sample experiment, and it was a slightly larger sample. This time we had 4 conditions because we wanted to introduce the high and low social media metrics as another factor. So here in the very simplest version, you see a fake story. So again, all of these are ambiguous, but fake stories. So you see a fake story with low social media metrics, fake story with high social media metrics, lots of likes and shares, debunked story, but with low social media metrics, and a debunked story with fact-checking with high social media metrics. And this time it was a story, again, you can notice that we're not talking about any politicized story or completely widely, kind of dramatic, kind of sensational stories, but these are plausible, at least that's what we perceive, plausible stories. So this was a story about how certain types of charities like the UNICEF USA were giving lavish salaries to their CEOs, whereas only a puny percentage was going to helping people. So I'm just going to go through the main findings and leave the details for you to explore perhaps later in the Q&A, or for you to explore in the paper, because we have a lot of fine-grained details that are a little bit complicated to describe. So I'll just go through the main findings. First of all, fact-checking reduced perceived quality of fake news. And this was the case across both studies. It was a significant effect. And if you can see, when there was only just the fake news about Carol Stern and fake news about the fish, you see a decent amount of, perceived news quality, and it significantly goes down once you see fact checking. Now, that's a real effect. So the belief may not have completely changed, but people are kind of saying, people who have seen news stories with fact check, they are saying that this is not really a high quality post story, but and that's pretty commonsensical. You might think that that's pretty intuitive. But if you put it differently, if you try to put a different interpretation on it, it's a bit scary, because if you don't have that fact-checking information, what you see is that people are reporting pretty decent perceptions of news quality. So the midpoint 4 was sort of the midpoint of the scale. And you can think of it as people reporting, oh, this news was average quality. And you see that in both studies, people thought that this was above average in things like accuracy, comprehensiveness, and blah, blah, blah. So people are not really seeing that this is inaccurate, fake news, basically. Fact-checking also led to greater third-person perception. So across both studies, we see that for those participants who saw fact-checking debunking information along with the fake news, they reported greater disparity between the influence on others versus the influence on themselves. So again, that greater disparity, it's a good parallel from the past work on third-person effects, where you see that any kind of negative media content typically triggers this, oh my gosh, others are going to be so, harmed by this. I am so fine by this kind of disparity. So you see this disparity across both studies. It triggers, the fact-checking information triggers people to perceive a huge gap between how others are influenced and how they are influenced. And as you can see, I didn't highlight it here, but as you can see, that has some behavioral effects, in this case, on reducing sharing intentions. Finally, fact-checking was found to nullify the effects of social media metrics. So in the non-fact-checking condition, when you just see the fishy story, when you just see the Carol Stern story, high social media metrics leads to high sharing intentions. And that's very natural. It's in line with what we have learned in past work, that people tend to want to latch on to stories that have high likes and comments and shares. So people report wanting to share those kinds of stories more. But once we introduce fact check, so once we kind of append that piece of fake news with the fact check information, we see a nullification of the strong effects of social media metrics, which is always it's an effect that has always been found. So you no longer see any difference. So that's a non-significant effect. There's no difference between the sharing intentions of whether there's high social media, so highly shared fake news versus highly low, not so much shared fake news. It really didn't have an effect on people's sharing intentions. So basically, we see kind of a nullification effect. Just to draw some conclusions here, what we identified is that, and this is sort of where this entire study has started, is that fake news is not really self-evident. And the power of fact-checking may come from the fact that it just flags, it introduces a small crack in the way people think or view this piece of ambiguous information. And so fake news is not always self-evident. It's not always about the magnetic arm after vaccination. There could be subtle stories that introduce ambiguity and uncertainty. In those cases, fact-checking could be very much important in indicating kinds of problems. Fact-checking also curbs the spread of fake news. So again, our focus was on the behavioral ramifications, the spread, or curbing the spread rather than the the belief correction effect. TPP was identified as a novel mechanism. This was the first time that any study had looked at TPP as a mechanism of fact-checking effects. And finally, that high SMM no longer exerts influence when fake news is shared. So I think I'm going over time, so I'm going to end here. So once again, thank you, everybody, and I look forward to your questions. You can access the paper through the QR code, and I'd be happy to share with you the full paper if you just email me. Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much, Prof. Nuri. And as what Prof. Nuri also alluded to in her presentation, while fact-checking could be a solution to the prevalence of fake news around us, it might also backfire as the discourse on fake news could actually lead to more skepticism and also increased distrust in general. So here to share his research with us is actually none other than our assistant Prof. Edson Tandoc Jr., also from our WikiWi School of Communication and Information. So over to you, Edson.
Thanks so much, Karen. Thanks, Nuri, for that wonderful presentation. Such a really tough act to follow. So what I'll do instead is promote IN-cube to all of you who are joining us. So let me first share about IN-cube. It's a relatively new center at the WikiWi School of Communication and Information. It's the Center for Information Integrity in the Internet. So these are some of our research areas. We are really focused on different aspects of internet use, not only in terms of the specific devices that are being used, but also the specific outlets that are being used. Also, whether people are investing in their information behavior, do they subscribe to certain media? And all of these, we're interested in these because we are also concerned about effects on, say, digital well-being, susceptibility to fake news. In the grand scheme of things, we are mostly interested in information quality and trust in information sources. So our main data gathering method is we do a panel survey every 6 months. So we track the same set of people trying to follow their media use, device use, and other measures. So we also do some other research data collection methods in between. This is our team. We are an interdisciplinary team. We are housed in the WikiWi School, but our committee members also come from School of Social Sciences, from NBS, from Computer Science and Engineering, and from RSIS. In the WikiWi School, we are part of the Misinformation and Information Studies cluster. So we also have a lot of cluster members who are part of the center. So if you want to know more about the work that we do academic research, but we also try to engage with the public and with the industry. So we do activities such as this webinar. We try to do monthly webinars. We also try to be active in the public space through news commentaries and news coverage of our research. And we also try to write academic publications here and there. So if you want to work with us or collaborate with us, please send us an email. You can also find more about IN-cube by going to our webpage within the NTU website. So the URL is there, or you can just Google IN-cube, NTU, and hopefully we should show up high in the search engine. Okay, so that's a short bit about IN-cube. Now let me talk about the research that I'm supposed to share with you today. This research is actually done with my co-author, Andrew Duffy. I think Andrew is here. Also with our Eureka student, Winnie, who has, I think, just graduated, so congratulations to her. And with my friend, Mo from Boston College. This is a problem that I'm facing. I forgot to My slides are changing automatically. So I think what Nuri shared earlier is how fact checking works, right? That's a good thing. That's important. At least we know that all these efforts trying to combat fake news by coming up with fact checking initiatives, at least we know that they work. There were some studies that talked about some backfire effect, but I think more recent evidence point to the difficulty of inducing that backfire effect. But what I'm concerned in terms of backfire is it's not backfire in terms of believing in misinformation, but basically increasing skepticism on media information sources in general. So I think fake news, it has been demonstrated how harmful it can be. It creates real harm against people, against reputation. In India and other countries, it has led to mob killings. But I'm also, as a former journalist, particularly concerned about its impact on journalism, especially in the long term. So in the short term, we've seen how fake news can take away audience attention from real news, how it has also been weaponized against journalists. Some politicians label stories they are not in favor of, right? Or that paint them in a bad way as fake news. And so I'm particularly concerned that fake news, aside from being weaponized against journalists in the short term, how it might also negatively impact journalism in the long term. So again, it's good to know that fact checking has been sprouting across many countries, and that fact checks work in debunking, helping correct misperceptions. But there might be some backfire effect, right, in terms of people being told again and again that what they're seeing is wrong, right? There might be a negative unintended consequence of reminding people that a lot of the information they see online cannot be trusted. One theoretical argument that we use in this paper is self-serving bias and attribution. Basically, this suggests that we humans are prone to alter our perceptions or our perceptions of causality to protect or enhance our self-image. So, for example, we take credit for success, but we try to usually blame external factors for negative outcomes. So, if we apply this into the topic of fake news, when someone is told that he believes something that was wrong or something that was false, in a way, if someone is told that he was fooled, right, it could be because of self-serving bias and attribution that the individual might try to blame others instead of blaming, I think rightfully, instead of blaming oneself, right? Of course, it's not entirely a person's fault that he or she is fooled, but with this framework, the blame might always be on external actors. It might be on the source of the fake news, but it might be blamed on the information ecosystem in general. Another theoretical framework that is guiding us is the concept of system trust. This concept offers insights into how exposure to fake news might undermine media credibility. So in brief, system trust is activated when everything seems to be in proper order. But any violation of system trust ruins the foundation of the relationship between the perceiver and the system, not merely at the specific content of the violation. So, I think this one we've had enough experiences of when everything is working well, then we're all happy. But when something breaks down, right, then we try to blame the system in general. And so what we did, we took several steps for the study. First, we did focus group discussions with 30 participants. This helped in designing our online experiment. We did 2 online experiments. The first one involved student participants, 188 of them. And then based on the results of the first experiment, we followed it up with another online experiment with 400 participants drawn from the Singapore population. So again, the goal for this is to really understand whether being told at the very, very simple level, if we were interested, if being told that you read something that's fake, whether you then blame the news media in general. So in the first experiment, that's what we did. We first measured perceived news media credibility at the beginning of the questionnaire. And then we did some distraction tasks and then exposed participants to either fake or real news posts. And then asked them a number of questions. And then finally, we debriefed them to say that, okay, if you were in the fake condition, we told you that it's fake. If you saw the real news post, we told them that they saw what they saw was real. And then after that, we again measured perceived news media credibility using the same scale that we used in the beginning of the questionnaire. And then we tried to compare whether there was a change from time 1 to time 2 media credibility rating. And this is what we found, as you will see in the screen. In the real post condition, when we showed people a real story, basically, but what we showed them is a Facebook mock-up. But we showed a real story and we told them it's real. We see that there's really no difference. There was an increase in news media credibility from time 1 to time 2, but that is not statistically significant. But when we showed them a fake news story and we told them that it's fake, then we see that there's a statistically significant decline in the perception of news media credibility in general. But then this is, I think, an informative, very descriptive study, but we still don't know what other factors might be affecting this, right? And so in the second experiment, what we did was we tried to compare people who were debriefed, who were told that what they saw is fake or real, with people who were not debriefed. Basically, we just exposed them to either fake or real stories, and then we didn't say anything. Also, we tried here in the second study, we manipulated the source. So I think the logical expectation, right, is okay, if I told you you saw something fake, then naturally you would lower your credibility perception, but perhaps only of the source of that fake news story, right? And so we also manipulated the source. Either the source is Straits Times, which is the paper of record in Singapore, or Singapore Daily, which is a fake news outlet that we created for the experiment. So my expectation was, if I tell you that you saw something fake and it was Singapore Daily, then your perception of news media credibility in general will not be affected, because Singapore Daily is a made-up, is a fictitious news platform. So we did the same procedure, but then included those two manipulations. We measured perceived news media credibility in the beginning, exposed them to either fake or real story, exposed them to either fake or real news outlet. We then exposed them to a debriefing or no debriefing, and then we did again measure news media credibility close to the end. And then we compared news media credibility in the beginning and in the end. So this is what we found. If participants weren't told that what they read, if there was no debriefing, what we see here is this one is not statistically, there's no difference from time 1 to time 2, either in the fake or in the real condition. But if we debrief them, if we told people that what they saw was fake or real, we see that there is a significant difference from time 1 to time 2. So if people saw real story and we told them that it's a real story, then being told that you saw something real increases the credibility of news media in general. Again, not of the specific source. But when we showed them something fake, and then we debriefed them that they saw something fake, then their perception of news media credibility in general goes down. So this is another representation of what we found. Here, what we're predicting is that the change in news media credibility scores. So again, just bringing together those two graphs that I've showed you. If there was no debriefing, there was really no change between the credibility perceptions before and after exposure to fake or real news. But when we debrief them, there is a significant increase in the real condition, and debriefed and told you it was real. And there was a decrease in media credibility in the fake news condition. So again, the question is, does the source matter, right? I mean, the logical expectation is the news media only gets hurt. We blame the news media only if the transgressor is part of the news media ecosystem, right? If ST was the one who is shown to be posting that fake news and we told people it's fake, then naturally it should bring down, to some extent, perception of news media credibility in general. But if it's a mock-up, if it's a fake news outlet, Singapore Daily, then that should not affect news media credibility at all. But what we found was, no, there was actually no main effect for type of source, nor did type of source interact with any of the variables. And so, okay, so I think, did I have anything before that? No. Okay, so I think this is if you want to read more about the study, you can just like Nuri, you can scan the QR code here. But for me, I think this is, of course, we were measuring credibility perceptions and change in credibility perceptions in a very short term. But I think there is, I think it is plausible that the short-term effect we're seeing here might be panning out in the long term as well. What we measured here is basically just being told that something you saw was fake, right? And we demonstrated that it can affect news media credibility perceptions in general. But then that's also compounded by not only people being reminded that they're seeing fake news, but also fake news being weaponized against journalists, right? Also, news organizations actually experiencing declines in their audience sizes and ergo their advertising revenues because people are being drawn away from real news sites and are now spending their attention and putting their eyeballs on non-legitimate news sites or non-news sites. So again, I think if there's a cumulative effect of all these things happening related to fake news that might in the long term affect negatively how much people trust in legitimate information institutions. So I'll end there and I'll turn it over to Karen and looking forward to discussing some of these with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to both our presenters for sharing their very interesting research. I'm pretty sure, some of you will have some burning questions for our two speakers here. We are glad that they can continue to stay on for a bit to answer all your questions. So we will now open the floor to Q&A. You can unmute yourself to ask your question, or if you prefer to use the chat group, the chat function, please do so as well.
Hey there.
Hello.
Nice to see you guys. Thanks for sharing. That's very important research, as you know. So I'm going to open up with a bit of a polemical. To what extent do you think using the label fake news perpetuates the idea that bona fide journalism is indeed questionable? My concern is that, all this research on fake news is just solidifying the position that Donald Trump took and other authoritarians, which are undermining the credibility. To what extent do you think your label might be actually perpetuating this kind of mindset and undermining the efforts of journalists who are trying to bring back integrity, respect, and credibility to news, bona fide news?
Okay. Prof. Edson,
I
do you
think
want
I'm
to
going
take
to
this?
ask Edson to answer this because he because of his paper on defining fake news. So I'm going to decline to answer.
Yeah.
I think I'll let Karen answer. Thanks, man. Thanks for joining us this morning. I think that is definitely a legitimate concern, and there are, I think, even in Europe, there was a move to ban the use of fake news as a term in government documents. I think part of that is what you just mentioned, but I think part of it also is just they're saying that it's almost meaningless now because of how different people use it. For example, some politicians use it to just label any news that paints in a negative light. Again, weaponizing it against journalists. I think you're right to some extent. Using the label itself is hurting the efforts of those who are putting together real news. But I also hesitate abandoning the term altogether because at least it's still a term that resonates with people. In studies that we've been doing and in-cube, when we compare this term with other terms, we see that fake news elicits the highest level of concern. For example, if you compare it with, say, the government term of online falsehoods. In terms of conceptually for research, I think fake news still has conceptual utility. It refers to a specific type of falsehood. I think the mimicking of news formats and language is something unique with fake news as compared with, say, other forms of disinformation as love scams or phishing emails. But I guess what I'm saying is that still does not undo the potential harm. And I think it is happening of using the label and how it might be contributing to the decline in trust in the news media. But what's the alternative? I actually don't. That's why I don't.
Misinformation. Just call it misinformation. You know, intentionally misleading information or something. I mean, if you weren't a colleague, I would come at you much harder, much faster. I'm being nice because you're my friend, but I really think it's problematic, and I would encourage you to stop using the label fake news. Obviously, it has a lot of cachet or at least a name recognition, but I think the definition is really problematic, both conceptually and operationally. And I think the sooner we start to move away from it, the better the interest. Even though you just said the real news, we shouldn't say real news. We should just say news. News has been defined. It has certain criteria to qualify as news, and we should return to that. Not because once you start saying real news and fake news, then you're kind of playing the game that authoritarians and others who want to undermine, the idea of disinformation is not to necessarily convince people of a specific truth. It's just to muddy the waters and make it unclear what any truth is. So I think that we have to work hard. The rhetoric is important. So I would encourage you, because you guys are very much, you have a high profile. And so I would task you with coming up with a more suitable nomenclature that would not have these kind of unintended consequences. Because I do think my sense is that this is perpetuating a mindset around certain practices that will make it harder for journalists to do their work, which is very important.
Yeah, point well taken. I will do a pushback though. I think at this point the ship has sailed. Even if I start switching my the term that we use in our studies, it's still a term that that people understand. In focus group discussions, when we talk about misinformation, they would refer to different other things. But fake news I think is a term that people understand. Other people with vested interests have misused it, and I think we should push back and clarify instead what it is supposed to mean. And I think misinformation is also a general term in academic use. Misinformation is a type of falsehood, regardless of intentionality. But fake news, I get, at least for the research that I do, because I'm more particularly concerned on the basically the use of conventions of news in being able to deceive people. For me, it still has conceptual identity. So I look at layout, for example, the inverted pyramid structure. And I always go back to, when we talk about fake luxury bags, right? We still can call them fake Louis Vuitton, and Louis Vuitton still sells, right? And calling, I think, a fake Louis Vuitton bag does not refer to the Louis Vuitton assembly line breaking down, but it's basically another assembly line trying to mimic an original.
I'm not sure I'm convinced by that analogy, but nice try. I would also encourage you to make sure the educational mission of in-cube, at the very least, I would encourage you to include in your debriefing some explanation of, clarifying why you're using that label. I don't think you need to use it in the titles of your articles. I think your articles will still get read even if you don't have fake news in there. I think I think it may be the former journalist in you who sees there's a news peg there, right? And I get that.
Yes, I had also do some pushback because I study fake news. So in the articles that talk about fake news, I try to include that in, in my keywords, for example. I also include misinformation and disinformation. So at some point it gets, I think it gets repetitive in my papers when I talked about the overall online falsehood space, that then you distinguish between misinformation and disinformation. And then one type, again, going down into lower levels of abstraction, that I talked about fake news.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to dominate so much, but we'll have a coffee and talk about this a bit more later.
Yes, I was just about to suggest, great points brought up. And, it is just unfortunate that the term fake news has been hijacked. And while I do appreciate, the suggestion of using maybe another term, but then again, there's no stopping that, the new term to getting hijacked either. You can call it misinformation, and the likes of Donald Trump can actually also misuse that same term and hijack that term. So I do feel, and I'm coming from a communicator practitioner perspective, I think a lot of education needs to be done. So how we use the term needs to be very well defined. And also moving forward, I think there is also the need to educate people what the term is originally meant and what is really originally meant for, right? So I would stop this question now, and I think thank you so much for kickstarting the Q&A. I'm quite sure we can take it offline as well with Edson, so that so we can have other questions as well, because I do think I see someone else asking a question. Thought I saw a question from Guan Ping. So Guan Ping is asking, with regards to Prof. Nuri's research on fact checking, which is a more prominent driver of PPP in this experiment. Is it the perception of oneself or the comparison with others? Okay, so that obviously is for Prof. Nuri.
Okay, so that's actually a really good question that I was sort of I didn't present fully in my talk. So I only talked about how having fact check will induce some kind of disparity. Oh my gosh, this is going to have so much effect on others, and oh my gosh, it's not going to harm me. So I talked about two things at once, because that was our measure of third person perception. So we did look at the gap. And so what we are seeing is that fact checking increases the gap. So it immediately tells people that this is harmful content. So that's fine. But I think what you're asking is it because people have a greater worry of the harm that it can do to others? Or is it because they are saying that, oh, well, I'm not really, like, I already knew? They are underestimating the harm that it can do to themselves. So this is actually a very classic question that has always been around since the beginning of the third person effects literature. So it's a really insightful question. But I guess, so what we found, and you can see this in the paper, is that it's actually driven by, my expectation was that it's driven by a worry for the harm towards others, but it's actually driven by the saying that, oh, I'm really not affected at all. So it's a huge drop as compared to when you're just seeing fake news. They think that they're affected this much. But when they see the fake news with fact check, they think that, oh, I am so not affected. So it's that drop. It's that difference between how you see yourself as being affected with or without fact check. That's the thing that drives this differential. And so that's kind of interesting, I think. I mean, we didn't have a hypothesis for this, but this was a post hoc kind of a test. And what this is telling me is that people are quite driven by their perceptions of themselves. And that's what motivates them to stop that click, stop that share in the moment, because they think that, because they are underestimating the harm that they see in themselves, that perception of the lack of harm on themselves is what demotivates them to do the sharing behavior. So that was kind of our, secondary finding, and thanks for illuminating that. But I think that's kind of asks us to do more research around this, why it's a drop in this, but not necessarily, because this first person component, the effect on the self, has always been sort of the third leg in the third person effects theoretical literature. People have always been quite focused on how much influence people perceive on others. Oh, the children, the average Singaporean, but not necessarily about the self. Self part was kind of secondary. And so I think by illuminating that the self is driving the effects, it kind of tells us something new to the third person effects literature. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Nuri. Do we have any other questions for any of our two speakers?
Hi, good morning. I had a question actually for Professor Nuri, because it was interesting. You're basically saying that labeling may be in a position to modify behavior in terms of sharing. And, just in terms of practice, I was wondering if there is any research that you've come across or anything in your research that might suggest then that labeling on, Facebook, for example, Facebook and Twitter, etc., have taken to labeling certain posts as fake or not, which in itself we've seen is a political decision. Do you think that has made a difference in behavior in terms of sharing, or does your the point being that that's precisely the reason why people surround themselves in an echo chamber, so that in some ways they can avoid certain sources which might conflict with their worldview or beliefs, because they don't want to come across such labels. So I was wondering if in the real world, labeling such posts has actually made a difference in behavior.
That's a really good question, and it's kind of speaking towards beyond this small experimental context. In the real world, people are maybe not exposed to this kinds of tagging because they may surround themselves with similar information. But if I'm not wrong, I believe that these kinds of, I'm not a social media expert, so I don't know if this is what happens. But if I'm not wrong, when they are so I keep going back and forth because I understand your question and then I try to counter argue. But okay, so in general, I think this tagging might occur to any piece of information. So even if you surround yourself to content that is quite amenable to your own interests and preferences, like maybe politicized, if that news has some kind of issues, the social media organization is doing the tagging. So they are the ones that are, maybe linking, this is potentially contentious, there have been disputes about this, or tagging the fact checking. So as much as I think your question is it makes perfect sense, and I kind of struggle to fully account for the actual environment. I think that even as they are exposed to content that is same types of content that they similar minded content, I think they might still be exposed to this kind of fact checking. And what we wanted to see was that when that happens, even if they don't change their minds, even if they still believe that charities have this kind of lavish salaries and they're problematic, we should scrutinize them, even if that was their initial thought, and even if that doesn't change, it might kind of make them second guess on the moment when they click on share. And so I guess that was the kind of the crack that I was referring to, that it might still have an effect on their sharing behavior. Hope that answers. Swati, thanks.
Thanks, Prof. Nuri. Any other question from the floor? No? Okay, so thank you all once again for your interest and also, the very insightful questions. If there are no further questions, we will end the webinar now. We also want to extend our thanks to, of course, our two presenters for spending time with us today to discuss this very highly, timely topic. And also thank you to all of you for your participation. So have a good day ahead, and we hope to see you again soon. All right, thank you. Bye.